All right. Hi and good morning or good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for Modernizing Encryption for Applications, Frictionless Workflows and Compliance. Today we are going to hear from Glennon Andrews and Ben Myers, and they will take you through what all of this means and how you can modernize your encryption. So, we will just a couple of things before we start. We're recording the webinar. It'll be available on demand. We'll send a link in the email, and we'll also have Q&A at the end. And we will get things started with Glennon, who will talk about the agenda.
Awesome. Thanks for the introduction, Beth. So I'm Glennon Andrews. I lead business development for PKware. So excited to talk to you today on the webinar. I'm going to go through a little background on PKware in general, just a high-level overview of our full suite of offerings. But what we're really going to dive into today is where our encryption for applications through our software development kit, how can that just make application level encryption easier and how that can fit into your workflows just to make it more of a seamless and stronger encryption activity. Ben will take over and talk in more detail from a technical standpoint of how that works. We'll share some real world examples and then we'll stop at the end for questions. So feel free to submit those through the chat function on this and we'll get those answered towards the end. So to start with a high level overview, many people are familiar with PKware because we actually invented the PK zip file format close to 40 years ago. And then over the years that evolved into encryption and now a whole platform around data-centric security. We do work with 21 of the top 25 US banks, a lot of insurance companies, healthcare companies, but even small credit unions, colleges and universities, and really any company. So don't feel like just because it says 30% of the Fortune 100 that we're limited to that with only working with huge companies. But from a regulation and compliance standpoint, those are usually the most highly regulated industries. So the ones that need data protection the most. So if you look at the wheel on the right, this kind of covers our entire gambit of what we offer from a platform perspective. PK Protect is the platform, and we want to do this end-to-end data protection everywhere. So large enterprises, it could be users and devices, and those are things like even users' PCs, file servers, SharePoint, OneDrive, where that unstructured data is commonly going to be moving throughout the organization. It's hard to classify, hard to understand what that is. We're going to do discovery and protection there. We're also going to do that on large data stores. So think about your AWS buckets or your Oracle and SQL databases, cloud repositories, data lakes, AI environments, those kind of locations with both structured and unstructured data. And then on the mainframe, we also do it there. So this could be large, huge transaction volumes. We are, an IBM partner and have worked with the mainframe, and that's been a core point of our offering for decades now. And then if you look at the bottom of the wheel from a define, discover, and protect, we do this through a lot of times it's going to be policies. So that policy-based protection is going to lay out what kind of data is sensitive and then what needs to happen with it. So it may be targets of certain repositories where data is stored where we need to do something like encrypt that data. We may say, let's find sensitive data where it lives and discover that on end users' machines or in file shares. So as soon as that data is, a save as function would happen, we'd essentially identify it. We could classify that and label it with something to show what sensitivity it has and control what can happen to that data. We may do actions like just report on it so you have visibility to know it's there, or it may be masking the data to remove the sensitivity, changing a certain name to another name so it's no longer sensitive. It may redact certain characters like everything but the last four digits of a credit card or social security number. But multiple actions to be able to clean up and even enforce retention policies to make sure that we're shrinking that footprint of data that could be at risk. So data discovery combined with actual remediation to do that. So next slide, Beth. But today, we do this encryption. We do it at both file levels, and then also transparent encryption that's more like a folder level encryption. But some of the things that happen with that is encryption. There's also a thought that that's going to break workflows. We do this for end users, but today, again, we're going to focus on applications because it's not just employees that have to think about or could break workflows with encryption. Applications need to access that. So they could run into situations where they may get blocked. An application can get blocked from accessing data, and that can break workflows. It can cause delays, and it can really impact productivity and the ability for people to do their jobs. So we want to have automation embedded into how our workflows work. Next slide. So how we do this, and it's this legacy encryption today. Typically, what we see from this is if an application needs to access a certain type of data, it's going to be decrypted. You're going to have that decryption event, or it's going to be written in plain text to disk, and then we're going to allow that application to be able to access the data. And then after that happens, after the data may be copied or it may be brought into an application or used by that application, then a re-encryption process happens. But that means that there's a period of time where that data is going to be accessible and it's going to be exposed to potential breaches. So that's really what we want to talk about today. So I'm going to actually hand the microphone over to Ben, and we're going to go through how our application level encryption would work, how this can be embedded and make the entire process a lot smoother and safer. So Ben, I'll hand it to you.
All right. Thanks, Glennon. We can go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about what application level encryption is via an SDK. So SDK, for anyone who doesn't understand or know what that means, it's a software development kit. Okay. What this allows you to do is to embed PKware's encryption and decryption capabilities into your applications. So that allows them to process this encrypted data without disrupting workflows. So as an example, right, if we think about what Glennon was just talking about of that traditional legacy flow, there's an encrypted file, let's say, that has to get ingested by an application. If that application doesn't know how to decrypt that file, that workflow is broken, right? And so like Glennon said, the typical flow is we're going to decrypt that to disk, allow that application to consume that file or that data, which presents the risk. So the SDK allows you to embed it in the application, and that encryption, decryption happens within the application itself. It never hits disks. And the result of that is applications can continue to interact with the sensitive data. And like I said, the workflow isn't broken, right? The other thing that it allows is it is consistent encryption across all the environments and workflows, meaning that you're ensuring your compliance, right? Anytime that you are required from a compliance regulation that the data is encrypted at rest or in transit, anytime that you're decrypting that, there's a risk, right? There's a risk of a breach. There's a risk that you aren't even compliant with that regulation because that data is hitting that disk. So the SDK is an offering that we have that allows you to ensure that that data is encrypted wherever it moves within the organization. Okay. Let's go into the next slide here. So how does this really work? All right. And this is kind of one flow, and I'll talk about how this can kind of almost be flipped on its head in general, right? So typical flows where you're talking about, a file server or somewhere where data is being encrypted, right? That means somehow data is, transactionally being moved to that file server. It might be an end user, creating that file. It might be an automated process, but the data is immediately encrypted with PKware. Okay. It happens as soon as that file essentially is dropped into a particular location. And then the typical flow that we've seen is the encrypted data then is moved, or there's a batch process that's going to move that downstream to different systems, right? And the way that I always think about this is, it might be an application that just needs to consume a file for whatever reason. It's an analysis application or any type of application that you internally at your organization are using it. However, again, that would require a decryption in the traditional workflow. In ours, that SDK now lives in that application. So the application can decrypt that file in stream using our SDK. So it never hits disk and you're 100% protected from a compliance side of things. Now, the other thing is, we're talking about decryption here. You can also flip this workflow, right? Meaning, let's say your application is actually the one generating the file, right? You can also flip this and use our encryption functions to encrypt that file before it hits disk as well, right? So, let's say, you're exporting a, inventory list that has customer information in it, right? You can embed the SDK in there, encrypt that file before it actually leaves the application. And then when it hits disk, it's encrypted. So this workflow kind of goes both ways with our ability to use the encryption and decryption functions. All right, let's go to the next slide here. Okay, so the next three slides, we're essentially going to go through real use cases of how our SDK has been used within our customer base. So why don't we go to the next slide here, Beth, and then we'll start with addressing what we call this BitLocker gap, right? BitLocker, right, is disk level encryption, all right? And that's okay, but it's not the level of encryption that we want our customers to use, right? And even things like compliance regulations and cybersecurity insurance, they're starting to realize that something like BitLocker doesn't go far enough, right? And the challenge that we helped the customer with was they had a sensitive data on about 1,000 different distributed systems. All right. This data was sensitive. It had, customer information. It had PCI related information. And on a daily basis, they were pushing data from those systems into their IBMI environment. All right. The problem is that at rest, that data remained unencrypted throughout the day. And the data, when it moved over to the IBM, was not encrypted in transit. Okay. So what did we do? So what we did was we allowed kind of two things. We embedded the SDK to allow the data to be encrypted by the application when it was exported. Okay, so this means that the data was never at risk or it never hit disk unless it was encrypted. All right, the data then was moved over to the IBMI, so the encryption stays with the file or that data as it moves over. So as it was going across the pipe and as it was getting moved over the network, it stayed 100% encrypted, and not just, pipe encrypted, right? Like true data level file encrypted throughout that movement. And then because our platform support is so robust, we not only support, Windows and Mac and all these other systems, we also support IBMI. So when that data hit the IBMI, we were able to decrypt that, um, move the data and export that where the customer needed it to be in the IBMI, and then re-encrypt it. Okay. So again, the end result was data never sat or moved unencrypted. All right. And this was specific to a GLBA compliance here, but there are several compliance regulations that something like this, in this example, where we're moving data and data is getting, exported and imported into different systems, the SDK is an invaluable piece to ensure that those workflows are protected, but also that those workflows aren't broken when we do encryption. All right, Beth, if we can go to this next one. All right, so the next kind of use case that I want to talk about is a PCI compliance one. And this is related to check scanning. So everyone here, when you get a check written to you, what do? Right? You open up your phone, your bank has an app, you scan it, and you get a little notification saying, all right, we scanned it. We'll let you know later if we were able to deposit. Well, behind the scenes, a lot of those systems, what's really happening is there is a workflow where that image is moving from your app to a server where it is being analyzed, right? Where it's looking at your bank number, doing, finding the right amounts, validating that signed, all of those standard check scanning requirements. Well, what we helped one of our customers do who provided this type of service is we ensured by embedding the SDK that as soon as that check image was taken, it was encrypted. When it was moved to, that service or that server offline, it was encrypted in transit as it moved. And then the application that they owned, which did the scanning, they also embedded the SDK there so that they could decrypt those check images and do the analysis. Okay. So all of that happened and all of the movement of the data was all encrypted. And the decryption, again, was done in stream. So it never hit the disk. And they were able to do that and implement that end-to-end workflow to ensure that that check scanning, that data, which is extremely sensitive, right? It was encrypted across the board. And the biggest thing that helped our customer with was maintaining PCI compliance in that workflow. Okay. All right, and then the last workflow that I want to or use case that I want to talk through is just an application level encryption. And this is really just a workflow example. A customer of ours, came to us with very stringent kind of compliance regulations where they wanted to avoid any type of data exposure in files that didn't impact their current workflows. And the workflow really was they had multiple applications, not just one. They had several. I think it actually was like 6 or 7 different applications that needed to access this sensitive data set. Okay. The data set was encrypted by PKware, but those applications couldn't decrypt that data. And so originally what they were thinking of doing was the legacy encryption workflow that Glennon talked about, right? They were going to take that data, drop it to a location, decrypt it all, let all these applications come in, consume what they need, and then re-encrypt it. Again, the issue there is that that data hit disk, and that was a compliance risk, and it broke their compliance regulations, right? It was a regulation that that data could never become unencrypted and hit disk in certain instances, all right? And so what we did, again, is we helped them embed the SDK into these applications. And when an application needed to consume it, instead of dropping the files again to an area and decrypting it all, they just interacted with it like it was a normal file, right? That's what our SDK does. It allows you to open that file, decrypt it in stream, and then do whatever you need to do with that data within the application. So the biggest thing that we were able to help them here is it wasn't just one application. These were several workflows that needed to interact with the files. And because we used the SDK, we were able to prove, one, that it worked, i.e. it didn't break any of the workflows. And the biggest thing was there was no unencrypted data that was written to disk. So very, very valuable from a compliance standpoint for that customer. All right, Beth, we can go to the next one. So just at a high level, I want to talk about essentially what features you get with our SDK. So I know we talk about you get the ability to encrypt and decrypt, and that's all true, right? But there's also some other compliance and features and benefits I want to make sure you understand. Obviously, we talked about this in depth, application encryption. That means data that applications are consuming can be encrypted and secured within that application, right? The other thing our SDK allows is format preserving encryption. So this is really, really important when we talk about can we encrypt, let's say, data that maybe it's getting inserted into a database or some other form? And the answer is yes, right? So the same kind of workflow we talked about previously can also happen when you're writing data into the database, right? Let's say you're consuming a credit card or social security number and you want to encrypt that, you can use the SDK, use format encryption or format preserving encryption, insert that into the database, which is essentially ciphertext then, right? And that data is never written anywhere outside of our SDK and our knowledge of it to be able to decrypt it. When you pull it back then, you use our decryption and voila, right? The data that was there originally is actually there in the presentation later. So format preserving encryption, very valuable for our customers as well. Encryption in motion. When we talk about compliance regulations, encryption at rest isn't as difficult. But a lot of the regulations now talk about encryption in motion, which really means that you need to make sure that that data itself is encrypted at the core, right? And that's what our SDK and PKWare offers with our encryption strategies. Um, Zero disk exposure. We talked about this heavily, right? That simply means the SDK allows you to do things in stream and in memory, which means it's never written to disk. And that gap or that risk is never there. Okay. Keeping workflows intact. Again, heavily talked about this in the use cases, but the worst thing that you can do, I feel like as a customer, as a client, would be use encryption everywhere and break all your workflows, right? It doesn't work that way, right? You have to have a cohesive strategy of when we do encryption because we need it, how are we going to make sure that that doesn't impact our end users, our applications? And the SDK and our solutions are exactly that answer, right? Um, Reduce audit scope. So we didn't hit on this too much, but when we talk about all of these workflows that where that sensitive data is hitting particular machines and there's different platforms that are involved, by being able to uh, prove and show assurance that that data has been encrypted, your audit scope and even the requirements on those machines can go down, right? A lot of the NIST formats and ISO standards, they all talk about, the best in breed, what should happen in certain instances and certain compliance regulations. Encryption, when you have that, reduces that scope tremendously, right? And then I'll talk about this, but broad platform support. Our encryption works really on almost any platform. We have Windows, Mac OS, Linux, Unix, Solaris, mainframe, IBM I. All of those platforms are supported, including cloud, right? So Microsoft 365, any of that area or those areas can be protected with our PKWare encryption. All right, Beth, we can go to the next one. Okay, so that's kind of what we have. We will open it up for some Q&A. And if there's any questions, you can just submit them in the chat and we'll kind of take them as we go.
All right, we have some questions. First of all, we kind of went over this, but maybe just, you know, simply put, what's the difference between the traditional encryption and the encryption offered by PKWare?
Yeah, great question. So when we think of traditional encryption, and really traditional, I'm just going to talk about kind of like a BitLocker, right? It traditionally had checked the box, and what that does is that is protecting really, I'll just say the container, right? It's protecting a broad area. However, as long as you have access to that key, you then have access to everything, right? The best strategy or example that I always think about here is, a BitLocker is essentially like your house, right? When you leave, you lock your door, right? That's what BitLocker does. There's one door to get into all your data. And if you have that one key, you suddenly are exposed, right? The way that PKWare handles our data level encryption is, yes, we want to protect that front door, but now if someone comes in, all your valuables are now in a safe, right? Because we're encrypting it at that data level, right? The other big differences from our side is our encryption travels with that data. So when we talk about, again, the movement of the data in that example of that safe, if you want to move it or you want to, you're moving it to another house or you're going somewhere else, that data is always encrypted. So when it's at rest and in motion, it maintains that encryption. All right. The other thing too, and the last thing is I'll just say we have the option. We support certificate or PGP encryption here as well, but in general, our customers use what we call smart keys. This is a PKI infrastructure that PKWare owns, meaning that all this encryption can be, certificate-less. All of your PKI that maybe you've invested in so far, yes, we can use that, but the goal would be to use our smart keys because all of that overhead of exchanging keys, making sure keys are there, is all eliminated with the PKware encryption architecture.
Great answer. I like to think of it as sticky encryption.
I like that.
Okay, the next question is about compliance, which we talked about in the one use case for GLBA. What are some other compliance regulations that application level encryption can help satisfy?
Yeah, good question. So I'll I'll say this a little bit tongue in cheek in terms of any, right? But I'll give you more specifics, meaning that when you hear about all of these breaches and different things, it really comes down to encryption wasn't used or encryption wasn't used in the proper manner, right? It's those instances where there's those gaps in the workflow where suddenly there's a breach and that bad actor realizes, oh, before they do this with this application, that data sits in this location unencrypted for 10 hours, let's just say, right? That's the risk, right? And the compliance regulations that we work with, especially because, Glennon mentioned this, but our customer base, when we're talking about financial institutions and, insurance organizations, those are some of the strictest compliance regulations. So common ones that we help with, so something like PCI, right? There's requirements in that regulation where, field level encryption has to be there, and encryption has to be used at rest and in motion. HIPAA. So HIPAA is a big one with our customer base. GLBA we talked about, which is really about financial institutions and how they encrypt their customer data. GDPR, we're not necessarily a full GDPR tool, right? But we definitely help in terms of our encryption and making sure that that type of data remains encrypted. CMMC. So CMMC is a big one on the government side. And really anything that works with, NIST 800-171, those are all kind of compliance regulations that are specific to government and defense contractors and how that data is controlled. So those would probably be from my side the biggest ones that we work with on a regular basis with our customers.
Yeah, Ben, I was just going to add that yeah, most of those NIST standards, it does feel like, and especially with CMMC being related to third parties working. So even the contractors now working with the DoD, because the defense, the Department of Defense, Department of War may send files back and forth. They need to now ensure that their third parties are actually encrypting that correctly. And again, as Ben said, it's at rest, in motion, and in use when applicable. So that's what we try to do. We're also coming out with strong post-quantum encryption algorithms, that are blessed by NIST that are going to be in our products at the end of this year. So we're actually headed to the future. So it is over encrypted, but that's what where we want to be. And so our customers are ready for those, future comings of attacks. So just want to add that.
All right, our last question, and you kind of went over this a little bit, but maybe it was a little quick. What systems does the PK Protect SDK work on? Are there limitations like other approaches?
Yeah, good question. So the SDK is supported in kind of two coding languages. So it's supported in Java or .NET. Um, in terms of actual systems that it runs on, we kind of went through this, but it's a broad support. Linux, Unix, Mac OS, Windows. Those are kind of the common areas. The other thing too is we even have customers that maybe there's a unique system that we don't support, or it's a legacy system that's 20 plus years old. We work with that all the time, especially at these financial institutions. And a lot of times what we help them with is really coming up with the right development architecture. And so if our SDK maybe cannot be embedded in one of those very old legacy applications, we then think about, okay, can we move it out a layer, right? Can we have kind of an SDK API application that's written in more modern technology, but can that be used to interact with those applications? Still ensuring the data's, encrypted at all times, but that's another option, in some of those legacy systems. And again, we have a full team of professional service experts that work with our customers to make sure that the workflows, the SDK, these nuances with the legacy systems, all of those things that can come up in the project. We've done it before, and we have the right people at our company to help you kind of make sure we have that support if needed.
That's all the questions we have, unless you, Ben or Glennon, have anything else you want to add.
I'd just say thanks for those. I hope we answered those responses were satisfactory. Whether or not, we would love to continue the conversation. So please reach out. We'd have happy to talk about your unique situation, show you more of a demonstration of how it works, and go through more specific examples. But this was great.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks.
And we have two blogs on our website that are focused on this type of solution that we offer that goes into that and shares some case studies and focus on both compliance and not breaking the workflows. But thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks.